We're kicking off today's explainer with a massive 9,000-year march through the history of abnormal psychology. And let me tell you, how we've understood the human mind over the centuries has gone through some wild, cyclical, and honestly surprising shifts. Let's just dive right in. Think about it for a second. How exactly did we go from drilling literal holes into people's heads to, sitting on a comfy couch in modern psychotherapy? It is an incredible evolution. But as you'll see, progress here is definitely not a straight line. We actually cycle back and forth over the centuries between very different ways of viewing the mind.
When we try to understand mental illness, it really all comes down to the why, or what experts call the etiology. Throughout history, society has essentially toggled between three core theories. First, you've got supernatural theories, blaming demons, angry gods, magic, or curses. Then there's somatogenic theories, which point to physical and biological imbalances, like genetics or bodily fluids. And finally, psychogenic theories, which focus on psychological stress, trauma, and distorted thinking. Keep these three in your back pocket, because we're going to watch society swing back and forth between them a lot.
So let's wind the clock way back. We're starting in the prehistoric Stone Age around 6500 BC, then moving into ancient Chinese medicine around 2700 BC, and classical antiquity around 400 BC. In these earliest eras, the supernatural was the name of the game. People genuinely believed that abnormal behavior was entirely out of a person's control, that it was driven by these unseen magical forces.
To give you an idea of just how extreme this supernatural view could get, look no further than trephination. This was literally the surgical drilling, or, chipping away, of a hole in a person's skull using crude stone tools. We actually have prehistoric skulls and cave art dating back over 500,000 years showing this practice. Why do it? The belief was that chipping a hole would allow trapped evil spirits to physically escape the person's head. Pretty intense, right?
Moving forward a bit into early Chinese, Egyptian, and Hebrew cultures, demonology and possession are still taking center stage. The go-to treatments, religious exorcisms, confessions, repenting. But we also start to see some primitive somatogenic or physical ideas mixed in there. For example, ancient Egyptians described women suffering from mental illness as having a wandering uterus. The Greeks later called this hysteria, and their highly unusual treatment for this, using strong-smelling substances to either lure or repel this wandering organ back to its proper place in the body.
Now, this supernatural dominance was eventually challenged by a huge paradigm shift brought on by the Greek thinkers. Hippocrates, the guy we call the father of modern medicine, completely rejected supernatural explanations. He categorized illnesses naturally into mania, melancholia, and brain fever. Then you have Galen, who followed Hippocrates, but importantly opened the door for psychogenic stress as a cause of illness. Plato stepped up to advocate for hospital care instead of treating the mentally ill like criminals. And Aristotle? He was writing extensively on consciousness. This was a massive intellectual leap. The absolute cornerstone of this new medical era was humorism. Hippocrates championed this heavily physical, somatogenic belief. He argued that your physical and mental health depended entirely on the balance of four bodily fluids: blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. So if you were acting too temperamental or manic, the belief was you literally had too much blood. The treatment? Bloodletting. It sounds brutal now, but this physical approach was revolutionary at the time and actually dictated medical treatments for centuries. But remember how I said history cycles? As we propel our timeline forward into the Middle Ages, through the witch hunts of the 15th century and into the 16th century, scientific thought tragically regresses. Europe is getting hammered by plagues, famines, and total economic turmoil. Society is desperate for answers. And so, they revert almost entirely back to supernatural theories to explain all the madness and suffering around them.
This reversion led to some truly bizarre phenomena. Mass madness literally swept through Europe. You had outbreaks of tarantism, where whole groups of people were gripped by this uncontrollable urge to jump, rave, and dance in the streets. People blamed it on demonic possession or maybe the bite of a tarantula spider. It later became known as St. Vitus's dance. There were even outbreaks of lycanthropy in isolated rural areas, where people truly believed they were possessed by wolves and would run around imitating them.
All this mass paranoia sparked a really harsh clash of ideologies. On one side, you had extreme supernatural persecution. The infamous 1486 manual, the Malleus Maleficarum, guided the cruel burning of over 100,000 presumed witches. But pushing back against this was a brave, early medical defense. Physicians like Johann Weyer, who's often called the founder of modern psychopathology, and Paracelsus boldly argued that these accused individuals weren't possessed by demons at all. They were just victims of natural mental diseases.
Even with those medical defenders, though, the standard treatment for mental illness remained incredibly grim. In the 16th century, we start seeing the establishment of early asylums. But do not let the word asylum fool you. Places like St. Mary of Bethlehem in London, infamously known as Bedlam, were basically prisons. They functioned as confinement for the poor, homeless, and mentally ill, strictly to keep them away from the public. Inmates were viewed almost like animals without reason. They were chained to walls, living in absolute filth, and sometimes even put on display to the public for a fee.
Thankfully, the cycle turns again. We move our timeline into the Enlightenment. The 18th century brings humanitarian reforms, the 19th century sees the mental hygiene movement, and the 20th century ushers in modern psychiatry. This marks a dramatic and much-needed shift from cruelty toward compassion and actual care.
This shift was spearheaded by a few key champions of humanitarian reform. You've got Philippe Pinel in France, William Tuke in England, and over in America, Benjamin Rush and Dorothea Dix. These dedicated folks fundamentally transformed the asylum system from literal houses of terror into places of healing.
The cornerstone of their work was moral treatment. Introduced by Philippe Pinel during the French Revolution, this was a radical therapeutic regimen. Pinel literally unshackled the patients at his hospitals. He moved them to well-lit, well-aired rooms and treated them with compassion and dignity, rather than just throwing them in a dungeon. Over in England, William Tuke did the exact same thing, establishing the York Retreat, where patients were actually treated as guests and given purposeful physical work in a really kind atmosphere.
What makes early American psychiatry so fascinating is how it straddled this transition. On one hand, you had Benjamin Rush, the founder of American psychiatry. Now, he wanted to help, but he was highly somatogenic. He believed the body needed physical fixing, so he still relied on intense medical treatments like bloodletting and even a wild restraint device he called a tranquilizer chair. But on the other hand, new American asylums, inspired by Duke's York Retreat, took a psychogenic approach. They prioritized compassionate care, dignity, and restorative physical labor over harsh medical interventions. As the 19th century rolled on, however, those early moral asylums became dangerously overcrowded, and conditions deteriorated right back to where they started. Enter Dorothea Dix. She was a retired schoolteacher who discovered these horrific, negligent conditions. And she went to work. She tirelessly advocated for the mentally ill, launched the mental hygiene movement, and directly helped establish over 30 compassionate state hospitals across the US and Canada. She essentially single-handedly saved the moral treatment approach in North America. Meanwhile, back in Europe, psychiatry was locked in a fierce battle over the origins of hysteria, which showed up as physical symptoms like blindness or paralysis but with absolutely no clear physical cause. Mesmer thought it was an imbalance of magnetic fluids, which is where we get the term mesmerism, an early form of hypnotism. Charcot argued it was a neurological condition. But then, Joseph Breuer and a young Sigmund Freud stepped into the ring. They used a purely psychogenic explanation, treating hysteria through the cathartic method, basically talking and recalling trauma. This, as you might guess, became the precursor for psychoanalysis, which absolutely dominated early 20th century treatment. Okay, let's jump to the mid-20th century. Here we see another dramatic swing back to somatogenic treatments. Before the 1970s, mental hospitals frequently used incredibly harsh physical interventions like electroconvulsive shock therapy and lobotomies. But this quickly gave way to a massive paradigm shift, the discovery of psychotropic medications. This booming pharmaceutical industry paved the way for the world of psychiatry we know today, viewing mental illness not as a spiritual curse or just psychological trauma, but primarily as a chemical imbalance in the brain. At the exact same time, public awareness was shifting drastically. This was largely thanks to media like The Snake Pit, which totally exposed the terrible conditions of overcrowded mental hospitals. This sparked deinstitutionalization. It was this vigorous, nationwide effort to shut down those massive, isolated state hospitals. The goal was to return psychiatrically disturbed individuals back to their communities, aiming for a much more integrated, humane system of care. And all these historical threads eventually build into our modern era. Today, contemporary developments in abnormal psychology have basically merged all of these historical elements together. We've seen massive biological and chemical discoveries. We've standardized our classification systems. We've integrated the psychodynamic perspectives pioneered by Freud, and we've seen the monumental rise of experimental and clinical psychology.
So the crucial point to take away from all this, it's the biopsychosocial model. This is the modern psychological standard. After millennia of fighting over whether mental illness is supernatural, somatogenic, or psychogenic, the scientific consensus is, well, it's all of the above. Actually, scratch that, minus the demons, of course. It's a complex interaction. Your biological genetics, psychological stress, and sociocultural environments all intertwine to influence your mental health. It's like a giant puzzle where all the pieces matter.
Now, to manage this incredibly complex understanding, we need a shared language. Thanks to the early foundational work of Emil Kraepelin, the American Psychiatric Association published the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or the DSM. This comprehensive system looks at clusters of symptoms to streamline diagnoses all over the world. Now, is it perfect? No. It continues to be debated and revised to remove past cultural biases, but it remains an absolutely vital tool for clinicians and researchers today.
So as our underlying theories continue to cycle, it really begs the question, what will the next paradigm shift in mental health care look like? We've watched the pendulum swing from mysticism to biology to psychology and now to a complex blend of all three. Centuries from now, will future generations look back at our current methods as enlightened or just another stepping stone in the long, fascinating history of the human mind? Something to think about. Thanks for joining me on this incredible 9,000-year journey today.